Thank you for the nice introduction. Yeah, really excited to be giving this talk and sharing my research with the UPenn community. The title for today is Generalist Robots for Healthcare, from Surgical Robots to Humanoids. So I would like to motivate this talk from the big problem that we face in society today, which is that our healthcare system is not at its best. To give you a statistic, there is a global shortage of about 11 million health workers worldwide. And these include people like nurses, surgeons, and physicians. And in fact, maybe if you look back to the last few times you went to the hospital for some serious medical care, you might remember some negative aspects. For instance, maybe it was very difficult to schedule appointments and get timely treatment. Maybe the bill was really high. Maybe you weren't very satisfied with some aspects of the treatment, and maybe there was a downright, medical error. And healthcare is such a important part of our lives, and it really is important. And there doesn't seem to be a good solution to any of these fundamental issues. And I think as roboticists, we have a unique opportunity to contribute to the solution through automation. And more specifically, if you look at some of the core activities that occur in the hospital, there can be more highly technical things like surgery to more laborious aspects like patient care and hospital logistics. And I think in the future, we will increasingly see robots being deployed, across these workflows. For instance, maybe we'll have surgical robots that will act as a surgical assistant, handing over surgical tools to the surgeon, and also maybe holding the endoscope during manual surgeries, or even performing fairly standard tasks like suturing, which is often done by surgical residents. And maybe we'll have humanoid robots looking after a patient, taking measurements, and just kind of bringing them things that they need, as well as just handling some of the laborious aspects of hospital logistics. And I think this is a really exciting future. Maybe it's not coming in the very, very near term, but I think it is a future that is likely to come. And towards this direction, there has been a number of research questions that I've been that has kind of driven my research. The first one is how can we build autonomous surgical robots? And more recently, humanoid robots that can help with labor in the hospital and also in other applications as well. And to kind of dig in more into this, I will talk about three projects today. To give you a brief summary, the first one is dexterity for surgical robots. This is kind of the first paper that looked at how to automate dexterous manipulation on a very standard laparoscopic surgical robot platform. And we looked at some of the core recipes to get this to really work well on a surgical robot. For the second project, we're going to look at sort of how do you automate realistic surgery. And so we deploy our policies on animal tissues, and we also address some fundamental questions like how do you handle long horizon planning, because surgeries often take a long time and long horizon tasks are hard. And also we'll look at some of the humanoid work. Let me just reduce the size. That could be potentially useful in hospital logistics and furthermore. And I'll also talk about other projects that I've been involved in towards the end. So let me first talk about this first project. We published this paper called SRT at Coral in 2024. And the main idea of this work is to think about how to automate these very simple and fundamental surgical manipulation tasks. For instance, tasks like lifting a piece of tissue, performing needle pickup and handover, and knot tying, which are relevant steps for suturing. And we have one of the most popular laparoscopic surgical robot platforms, the Da Vinci robot for Intuitive Surgical, and we equip them with wrist cameras to get a very close-up view of the grippers, kind of similar to what's been done in the robot learning literature. And I'm gonna kind of skip kind of the basics of imitation learning. I would assume there are folks who've kind of worked with these frameworks. And one of the first things that we've done in this work was implementing the most basic form of imitation learning. And so um, this is a video of ACT model trying to pick up a needle. So ACT takes as images as input, including wrist images and the endoscope images that you're seeing here. Oops. And um, and as you can see, the gripper is reaching for the needle, but at some point it kind of makes a slight error and it completely fails in the task. And one thing I want to mention is that this policy is trained with absolute actions. This is an important detail. And what we later realized is that um, the reason why this is happening is due to the inaccuracy of the robot. So the Da Vinci robot, despite being a precise surgical robot, has high forward kinematics error. It's about plus or minus 5 centimeters, which is really, really bad for a robot. And the reason is that the robot itself is cable driven. As you see in this wristed mechanism, it's being driven by these cables. And these cables can get stretched or loose over time, which causes hysteresis. And another issue is that, especially with the earlier Da Vinci models, they're using potentiometers for joint measurements. And potentiometers are highly unreliable sensors. You typically want to use motor encoders. And so all of these combined, it leads to forward kinematics errors. And so what happens is if you command your robot to reach a specific waypoint, it will never reach there correctly because of these forward kinematics errors. And that's how you're seeing those symptoms coming up when you actually deploy a policy. And so our key idea, our solution to this was actually quite simple. We basically, instead of doing absolute actions, now we're using relative actions. Of course, when you train policies these days, using relative actions is kind of like the go-to recipe, but there's actually a further advantage to this that I will discuss a little bit. And we do a little bit of some empirical tests to figure out like what is the best action representation that works best. And we ended up actually mixing the reference frames. So the delta position and delta rotations are defined with respect to two different frames. The delta pose defined with respect to the endoscope tip, and the delta rotation is defined with respect to the current end effector frame. And so we call this sort of the hybrid relative action because you have two different reference frames for pose and rotation. And just by editing the action representation, the policy starts to work. And this was a really surprising moment for us, but there's a little bit of intuitive explanation for this. So the main idea is that relative actions are actually quite robust to absolute errors. So if you kind of imagine a scenario where you're trying to pick up an object on a table, and because of forward kinematics errors, let's say your policy completely misses the object. But if your policy is using relative actions, your policy will observe that there's a gap between your object and the gripper, and it will try to generate relative actions to kind of close that gap. So if you're using absolute actions, then you might get stuck. But if you're using relative actions, you will get your policy will keep steering you towards the object because relative actions are as long as relative actions are somewhat consistent, right? And you can kind of see how relative action can be really helpful when you have absolute errors, as long as your delta motions are fairly consistent. And this is actually a very important problem because all the Da Vinci's have different error properties. So if you're collecting data at scale across like 30 different Da Vinci robots, they're all going to have different errors. But if instead of doing any sort of hand-eye calibration or trying to um, um, do some kind of system ID, you can actually just use relative actions, and it seems that you can get fairly precise policies. And so this is our performance on all the three tasks that I mentioned earlier. And within about 200 to 500 demos, you can get a very decent policy that gets about 90% success rate. And just kind of point out the details, you can kind of see that the environment is being perturbed. So the suture pad is being shifted around. The state of the string is also being shifted. And we're also distributing the needle across the workspace so that we evaluate if the needle is being picked up from various locations. And just to kind of make this point across, if you use, oops. And so this is the baseline performance. If you were to use just absolute actions and not use relative actions, then your policy completely fails. Again, because of forward kinematics errors, and relative actions do a really good job in compensating for that. And this is just a fun video that we recorded um, where we're just kind of like stress testing the model, and we use a screwdriver to kind of knock off the loop, and the model sort of recognizes that and is able to retry. And we never collected any of our knot tying data on pork. We always collected on this yellow suture pad environment, and you can see in this novel setting, it's kind of hesitating, but it kind of like gets what it needs to be doing. Um, it doesn't happen all the time, by the way. These policies, these are kind of like cherry pick demos, if I'm being honest. And same thing with needle pickup. Oops, just moving some tabs around, and it's able to recognize failures and also be able to pick up this needle in these novel, unseen chicken thigh, pork loin, and 3D suture pad environments. Um, uh, and I think overall, to summarize this part of this task, part of this project, um, what we learned is that imitation learning is actually a fairly robust and simple to implement recipe for surgical tasks. And as we've shown earlier, action representation matters a lot, especially if you have inaccurate kinematics. If your kinematics is unreliable, then probably use relative actions. And I didn't talk too much about this, but I think for surgical robots, wrist cameras are also very helpful in improving the policy performance. So this was kind of like a first step in the community towards performing dexterous surgical manipulation tasks in the surgical domain. But we wanted to do a little bit more than this, right? Surgical tasks seem to be working in these sandbox environments, but is this going to actually translate to clinically relevant scenarios? And this leads to our next project. And this paper was called SRTH, and it was the cover of Science Robotics in July 2025. And we were really grateful for the attention it received. And this was joint work with Stanford and Hopkins. Did I hear somebody? Yeah.
Yes. Is it possible to ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So it seems to me that you're maintaining a very anthropomorphic kind of approach to things. Presumably, there are many other ways you could grab the needle or tie the suture or pick up the suture. And I'm wondering, I mean, a lot of the kind of surgical tools were designed obviously for people. Do you think there's any advantage to not going anthropomorphically in terms of your designs?
So using hands instead of grippers?
Well, I mean,
Or
so for example, you could pick up a needle with an electromagnet. You could use suction. You could use lots of things that, are not available to a human, but might be easy and reliable.
yeah, definitely, there's always that kind of design decision, right? Like, should we go with a specialized design, or should we kind of like keep the hardware general, which kind of opens the possibility of doing many things with a general tool. And that's kind of the direction that kind of this generalist approach is kind of like the direction that we were going for. But definitely, it is valid to create specialized tools, but there's also the cost, right? You have to like constantly change out tools, and there's I think there's always like good pros and cons, but it might be more reliable too. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. And yeah, feel free to interrupt, and I'll try to make some pauses throughout so that people can ask questions. So there are multiple aspects of realistic surgery. So one of the aspects that uh, of surgery is that a lot of the times you have to deal with very long horizon tasks. And so I wanted to kind of talk about like fundamentally what makes a long horizon task hard. And the issue with long horizon tasks is that there are many points for failure because a long task is a chain of many subtasks. So if you make a small mistake in a subtask, then you might actually be compromised for the entire task. And so this is kind of the aspect to it. And our solution to it was to create a hierarchical model specifically a task planner model that will kind of help the low-level policy recover from small mistakes. So let me kind of walk you uh, through this a little bit. So uh, if you have a image observation from the surgical endoscope, we feed it as input to the high-level policy. And you can think of the high-level policy as the task planner. And it will generate a language instruction telling the second model what to be doing. And this language instruction can be two types of instructions. It can be task-oriented instructions or corrective instructions. So task instruction is very intuitive. It's related to the task that you should be doing. For instance, grabbing the suture needle, cut the artery, whatever the task you need to be doing. And corrective instructions are more things like that serves to kind of correct for errors. And it's often directional. It'll be things like move the left arm to the right, move your right arm towards me, away from me, and so on. And you can kind of think of this as, when you're in the operating room, you have the surgeon and you have the surgical resident, and the surgeon is watching the surgery, and maybe the surgeon is like, "Oh no, I think you're doing this wrong. I think you should move your right gripper a little bit to the right." So you can kind of think of this corrective instruction as similar to that. And then the low-level policy takes either of these instructions and then along with image observations to generate the level trajectories for the robot. And so this portion is low-level policy portion is identical to the part you saw in the previous project. We're just adding a high-level policy that's kind of regulating the task, and whenever it detects mistakes, it will kind of generate these corrective instructions to kind of correct for small errors. And if you can correct for these small errors, then you'll be less likely to fail in each subtask and ultimately succeed in the long horizon task. And the nice thing about this is that the interface between these two models is just English language. And so the surgeon can choose to intervene by talking into a microphone, for instance, and be like, no, 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 I don't like what you're doing right now. I want you to cut the artery first instead. And once the intervention happens, then we override the language instruction generated by the high-level policy, and we just use whatever the surgeon instructed the low-level policy to do temporarily. And the nice thing about this is that whenever the surgeon intervenes, that's a corrective event. And so we can log this event and send it back into your dataset for further fine-tuning your high-level policy. And this is kind of nice because the more the surgeon interacts with the robot, those are more corrective events that the model can use to kind of further fine-tune itself, and it will get better and better. And this is something that originates from also Yell at Your Robot, and we kind of made some changes to it. And Lucy, who worked on this, is also a co-author in this paper. So let's try to contextualize how this model works in a real surgical task. What we're working with here is a gallbladder removal surgery. So gallbladder is this sort of balloon-like organ that sits below the liver. And the objective is to extract that outside of your body. And this is a very commonly performed procedure. It's performed about 1 million times a year in the US alone. There are primarily 3 steps to this procedure. The first step is to kind of detach the gallbladder from the surrounding organs, all these connective tissues, and it's also attached to the liver and so on. And the second step so the gallbladder is attached to other organs through these ducts and arteries. And so before you cut them, you have to add these sort of white clips so that when you make the cut, none of the internal fluids will flow out. And then finally, once it's totally removed, you put it inside the bag and take it out of the body. And we're focusing on the clipping and cutting portions because it's the more simplest one, simpler one. And just like before, we're using the Da Vinci robot, and we have this pig gallbladder that is isolated from the body, and we dissect out this sort of the region of interest so that we can clearly see the duct and the artery structures. And these are the structures that need to be clipped and cut. And compared to before, we now have to deal with 3 different tools, and it will be handled by a single model, specifically the clip applier, the scissors, and the forceps. This picture kind of shows the amount of diversity that we have to deal with, because unlike in the previous project where we have like a sandbox environment, now you're actually dealing with the messiness of the real world. And so I just want to kind of highlight the diversity that you would encounter in these kind of surgeries, and to kind of point a few things out, you can kind of see the duct and the artery structure, kind of these sort of 2 parallel tubes, and you can see across all these pigs, the diameter, the visual appearance, the amount of connective tissue left on them, they're just all so different. When you deploy this policy, you're never going to get the same gallbladder that you saw during training. It will be a totally different environment. So this is what one aspect of surgery that is very hard compared to, say, doing the dishes in the same environment. So to kind of show you the results, this is our policy performing fully autonomously. So this video is not teleoperation. And you can see the clipping and the cutting tasks being performed. And at the top left, you can see the language instructions generated by the high-level policy or the task planner. And so I wanted to kind of highlight a few interesting things. Obviously, the high-level policy is saying grabbing the gallbladder, and so the low-level policy goes ahead and grabs the gallbladder head. And what you see here is that the policy actually makes a small mistake because it needs to be targeting the left tube towards the bottom, but it ends up kind of getting stuck on the right tube. And what happens is that the high-level policy kind of notices that error, and it starts to generate a corrective instruction saying like move the right arm to the right because you have to get unstuck from this environment. And then it's saying move right arm towards me because you have to clear this obstacle. And then it's saying move right arm to the left so that it can kind of target this left structure. And then once the policy is self-corrected, then the high-level policy starts generating the task instructions again. So it's saying that clipping first cut the left tube, which is the task instruction. And this sort of failure event also happens here again. And then the high-level policy also kind of generates these sort of self-correcting commands until it's stabilized and it goes back to generating task instructions. And it's also able to make this irreversible cut. And the right tube in general has been much easier because there's no obstruction, and overall the policy seems to be handling this situation, this particular tubes quite well. And so we deployed our model on 8 unseen gallbladders, and in all of these experiments, we did not have to do any intervention. So we thought this was like a very a successful experiment, but that is not to say that our policy is perfect. We had to collect enormous amount of data and had a lot of trial and error in getting to this point. Especially the data was the most important part, I'll say. I didn't talk too much about it, but and we also kind of did our best to kind of constrain the environment. For instance, we always kind of focused the gallbladder near the center of the image, and we also always propped up the gallbladder so that it sort of kind of sits at a certain angle. So we did a little bit of massaging to kind of constrain the environment, but within this sort of healthy gallbladder with these parallel tube, it's not a diseased gallbladder, right? It's able to work fairly well.
Question? Do you have time?
Yeah.
Do you have the ability to essentially classify atomic structures within the gallbladder so that you know that this is whatever artery and this is whatever duct before the high level? Is the high level instructions using anatomical knowledge and also some form of visual classification for the structures there before it?
Yeah, so we don't go into that much detail into that. We kind of like treat these as 2 parallel tubes, and it doesn't matter if the left side is the artery, because like sometimes, usually the left side is the duct and the right is the artery, and even if they're switched, we're just calling the left and right tubes. But yeah, if you wanted to kind of give more granular instructions to the robot, then you would have to train it that way.
Well, so in other words, in the case where they aren't what you do might not be interchangeable. Unless if you're only specifically training it for this view of this specific gallbladder surgery, I guess it doesn't matter that you give it the right name. It's just matters that you give a consistent classification. You know what I'm saying? Or am I being weird? In other words, you don't want to confuse your right and your left tube in some situations. Right? Who cares what you call it? But you might want to identify them for.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess like the language instruction kind of um says what needs to be targeted. And yeah, I mean anything beyond that is sort of implicit. Like we hope that the model is able to, target the right the left tube when you say left tube. Um but yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, thank you.
I
Yeah.
have a question as well about the data collection process. Was it mainly like, first of all, how much data, presumably during like test time, there'd be extremely different scenarios and training testing. So like, like how much data was needed to be collected? And was it teleoperated or like a mix of teleoperated as well as like visual inputs from like the cameras?
Yeah, so we had about 20 hours of data across 35 gallbladders, and we were very, very careful about curating this data set. Like I personally watched through like 90% of the data so that it's like high quality data. There's like, no mislabels and no mistakes. Um, and perhaps one interesting aspect of this that I didn't mention is that we record a lot of recovery data, and that's kind of like why you're being able to see these like very robust recovery motions. And the way we did this is we basically knew how the policy fails, or we could imagine like when you're grasping an object, like you can miss in various ways, right? So we initialize the gripper in this sort of mistake or failed state, and then we just start the recording from there, and we just teach the recovery portions. And so about 40% of our data is just, you know, helping the policy like collecting this recovery data so that whenever it makes mistakes, it will be able to recover. Um, but in terms of the structures, like of course, like you are seeing a totally different gallbladder, but um, usually like you can kind of view this sort of environment as like a red background, which is like the liver and all these like two parallel tubes, right? So that part is always clear. So the perception wasn't super hard because we kind of made it that way, but in real surgery, like so in most cases, surgeons won't really like dissect the tubes all the way, so that's like to the bare bones tube. So perception can be much harder than what you see here in real life. Yeah, cool. Yeah, so I think this video kind of relates to this. So what we're showing here is sort of these stress tests or self-corrective behaviors. So what we're doing here is we're just putting these grippers in these really odd configurations, and we're trying to see if the model can, correctly identify when needs the task and also be able to kind of and perform the task very well. And it's able to kind of recognize that the gallbladder head needs to be grabbed, and we initialize the gripper like very far away from the camera at the bottom left. And you can see that it kind of recovers from those states. And we also collected a lot of data like this, where we just sort of like have this gripper at some really weird configurations, and we wanted to be able to kind of recover from those. And it's actually taking like multiple tries at this, which is really cool. And this is like another kind of sort of like a bad failure case where you're trying to clip both the duct and artery. You always want to target a single tube. And um, and so when this happens, we actually, taught the model to sort of pull itself out and only target a single tube. So these are kind of the explicit scenarios we also collected a lot of data for, the so-called recovery demos. And this is another scenario where you're trying to clip the duct and it's sort of missed and it kind of overshot. And you can see that it's able to identify that and correctly place these tubes, these clips. Um, and so this is some of like the quantitative results. So we tested on this is like an ablation study where we sort of take out each components of our model and try to see how it affects our final model. And we tried like task instruction only, so there's no corrective instructions. We also tried no risk camera. The high level dagger, what this means is that remember when we talked about we can kind of supervise the high level policy through verbal corrections. We call that like the high level policy dagger. And then end to end is like no hierarchical structure. You just have single policy. And you can see that the y-axis is the success rate. You can see that all of these design choices has contributed to the overall success of SRTH. And the second plot here is is the data efficiency plot. The x-axis is like the amount of data you always use, and the y-axis is the success rate. And obviously, about 35 gallbladders is sort of the number of organs that we had to use for this particular experiment to get decent performance. And again, like we were using very sort of healthy and kind of parallel tubular structure gallbladders that were somewhat easier to work with than like, very diseased and hard to see messy gallbladders. I'll skip this part, and this is another sort of a stress test where we found some pictures of a human gallbladder that's like really bloody, kind of bleeding can happen, and we tried to simulate that on the pig by adding food coloring to it, and it's not always like able to be this reliable, but in one particular case, we were able to actually like perform a significant part of this procedure despite having never trained on this sort of bloody scenario. And so, there is, obviously some robustness built into the model that you get for free, and I think it's kind of promising to be able to see that.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Time. Yeah, so to summarize this part of the project, through SRTH, we showed that I think what's really an important message to the community is that, you can actually deploy end-to-end learning models on like surgical environments where you have your training distribution and of organs, and then you test it on a totally unseen organ, and it seems to work. And of course, like kind of figuring out what that, whether the gallbladder that you're operating on, whether that fits into your training distribution, I think that's another question. But it is possible. I think that surgery and AI can be something that can be realized. We also talked about how we can address the long horizon steps using hierarchical approach. And we also talked about how we can kind of steer the model through verbal interactions. And SRTH is a generalizable design. It can be used for any other surgeries. So we're actually working on getting this model to be deployed in other kinds of surgeries, and I'll be happy to share more updates on that once we get some good results. Cool. So we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about humanoid applications. And this is something I've been kind of working, after I moved to Stanford from Hopkins. And again, kind of coming back to this picture, I think robots can be useful outside the operating room by providing patient care and handling logistics. And there's kind of one caveat to this, which is that in order to train these policies, you need to collect teleoperation data, and you have to be sort of operating these robots in a sort of a safety critical environment where you have patients and you have a lot of people walking around in the hospital, and that's kind of undesirable, right? And one of the solutions that we were thinking about to address this is utilizing human data to teach the robot necessary behaviors. So imagine like you have a policy, like a generalist policy that can perform a lot of different types of manipulation tasks. And what if we can just sort of collect human data showing what needs to be done, but it uses a lot of the skills that the robot already has. And by sort of watching human videos, can the robot actually like be adapted to this new novel task based on watching what the human is doing? And so I'll talk a little bit in more detail about this. But before diving into this a little bit, I wanted to kind of motivate why we would be interested in using human data at all. And I think there are a few advantages to using human data. The first one is that human data can be collected more easily and at a larger scale and breadth. And another important point is that if you look at the success of LLMs, they were successful because they had this internet scale data to train their models on. And this internet scale data wasn't like manually curated. It was, it was scaled through natural, human interactions and a lot of people interacting with the internet. And so if you kind of take this analogy to robotics, are we really going to get scale data through just manual teleoperation and iterating through every scenarios? Or can we just treat robots as humans and and just collect a lot of egocentric data by, say, wearing these glasses. So for instance, like Arya from Meta came up with these sort of the egocentric devices where you can just sort of wear the glasses and you just walk around, and it is able to kind of perform self-pose estimation, which is essentially extracting the kinematics of the human, which is the robot, and it can also map the environment and record RGB images. And there's also like the Meta Ray-Ban glasses, which is perhaps not suitable for this level of of reconstruction, but there are millions of these glasses that were sold. And so it kind of opens your imagination. Like, what if you had such large-scale human data, that is super diverse and in some ways much better than robot data and the diversity? What can you do with it? And the final reason is that um, I think robots are becoming more human-like, and I think there will be a future where robots will essentially look like humans. So, there'll be a robot sitting across from you, and you will not be able to tell if it's a human or a robot. And the robot will have like the skin color that looks very human and has the hand morphology will be like very human-like. And so there's literally zero gap between humans and robots. So why not just use humans to collect data in that case, since you have no domain gap between robots and humans? So these are kind of some of the ideas that kind of excite me about utilizing human data. But our objectives in this project are a little bit more specific. So in this project, we're interested in two objectives. The first one is developing a practical recipe for cross-embodiment learning between humans and robots. And I'll talk about the recipes that we came up with. And the second objective is that we wanted to study more carefully how human data can help robots. So like if you look at a lot of the existing work on human and robot co-training, often they will just kind of collect human data and robot data on the same environment, and they will kind of demonstrate that you get better performance because you have the extra human data. But we wanted to actually study exactly how human data can help robots generalize. And so we identified 3 levels of generalization. And specifically, those are novel object and spatial generalization, semantic generalization, and compositional generalization. And these are increasing levels of order of generalization. And I'll also talk about how we came up with design choices to sort of unlock more increasingly harder levels of generalization. So let me kind of first walk you through some of the solutions that we came up with, and also the problems. So one of the problem with with this sort of cross-embodiment learning is that robots and humans have different visual appearance. And to kind of help with this, what we're doing is overlaying these sort of colored skeleton overlays. And these are color-coded so that a particular finger on the robot aligns with the color of the particular finger on a human. And so we're kind of explicitly teaching the policy that, this particular finger on the robot hand aligns with this particular finger on the human hand. And so we're trying to kind of help this cross embodiment learning. And just to kind of give you a sense, this is what it looks like. We're using Manus gloves in this context, but it also works with bare hands. And this is kind of the one design choice that we came up with. And the next thing is adapting VLAs to high dimensional hand actions. So the problem is that most state-of-art VLAs, for instance, Pi05 is one of the famous ones, is that they're trained on gripper-based robots, and this leads to action dimensions being about 32, which is too little for dexterous robot hands. Robot hands for a particular hand can have up to 20 to 22 joints. So all things considered, for a humanoid, you need about 54 action dimensions. So this obviously exceeds the action dimensions of gripper-based robots. And of course, you can solve this problem by editing the pre-trained model weights. You can just increase your projection layer so that it adapts to larger action dimensions, but you're perturbing the original model parameters, and that's not what you want to do. And so what we came up with was pretty straightforward, which is just to distribute your action across 2 tokens. So specifically, this is your action expert that are generating the actions, and this is the VLM portion that kind of ingests all your observations and state. And so what we're doing here is, a single token is responsible for the left-hand action, and another token is responsible for the right-hand action for a single time step, and the same thing continues. So you're just, assigning 2 tokens per action at a particular time step, rather than just having 1 token per action. And this effectively reduces your action chunk from like 50 to 25, but this is definitely not a huge problem. So this is our second design. And there are other kind of practical design choices we have to think about. For instance, humans and robots have different rate of performing the task. So human is always about 2 to 3 times faster than the robot. So we had to apply some tricks so that we ensure that the trajectory length of the human and the robots align. And another kind of underrated thing is that like you cannot have messy human data because you need highly accurate human pose estimations, and these trajectories must be high quality enough that they're replayable on the robot. So here you can see Ke, who's a student working with me, kind of performing this tomato sorting task, and we have to make sure that these trajectories are actually viable on the robot. So this is just open loop replay of his trajectories on the robot. It's not able to grasp the tomatoes like off the fly because we're not able to kind of close the physical gap yet. But you can see that we're helping with the feeding of the tomatoes, but it's able to kind of correctly place the tomatoes at the correct bins, and the motions is not jittery. The overall motion is correct. Yeah, so and let me kind of talk about our study, which is understanding the levels of generalization that human data enables robots. So the first, perhaps the simplest form of generalization is novel object and spatial generalization. And the question here is, can we use human data to help robots reach unseen locations and also pick up unseen objects in those unseen locations? So let me kind of put this in context of an actual task. So here, what we're teaching the robot is just pick and place the block into a bin. And we only teach the robot how to pick up this object in a particular in-distribution region in green. And it never kind of leaves this workspace. And when we ask the robot to kind of pick up the object from a, hold on a second, let me just move this tab. When we ask the robot to kind of like pick up the objects from like a totally unseen workspace, it's not able to do so because it has never visited those workspaces. And so what we do is, in addition to the robot data we have, we collect human data that reaches inside the in-distribution region and also the out-of-distribution region. So we're kind of expanding the workspace of the robot through human data. And just by simply co-training on this data, we show that the robot is able to comfortably reach out of its in-distribution workspace and able to also be able to pick up these novel objects in those sort of unreachable regions that it has never seen during training. And so I think this is kind of one of the simplest form of generalization that human data could enable. To kind of walk through some of the numeric results, we evaluated different types of models. So we have our robot-only model that was not co-trained with human, and we have robot plus human data, but there's no skeleton overlay. These are like the colorful lines I showed you earlier for closing the embodiment gap. And then the third one is robot plus human, but there's no pre-training. And so, and this is ours, which combines robot plus human data and also the colorful skeleton overlays. And if you see the pick and place performance in out-of-distribution regions, you can see that skeleton overlays and also co-training with human data really helps the robot kind of reach out of bounds and also be able to pick up novel objects. So arguably a harder form of generalization is semantic generalization. And the question here is, can we like use human data to teach like task semantics? For instance, let's say you have a sorting task and you have an object that you have never seen before and you don't know how to sort it. Can human data teach a robot how to sort these novel objects by simply co-training with the robot? And so to kind of set up this experiment, we taught the robot these various basic skills. We taught the robot that the red block belongs in the left plate and that the blue block belongs in the right plate. So this is like sorting, right? This block goes there, this block goes there. And when we show the robot completely unseen block colors, so the robot has only seen red and blue, but we show robots like the yellow block and the green block, which is colors that it has never seen. And obviously, because we didn't really teach the robot how to sort these objects, it will sort them completely incorrectly. So we'll just kind of like take a random guess of where to place it because it knows that it's a block. But what we do additionally is that in addition to the existing robot data, we collect additional human data where we sort the blocks to, where we teach the robot how to sort these unseen blocks. The yellow block goes to the right and the green block goes to the left. So now by co-training, the robot is equipped with this knowledge of how to sort these unseen color blocks just by co-training with human data. And so, and the result shows that you can actually sort these objects correctly. The robot is able to do so just by simply co-training with human data. Yeah.
Could this work with an animated limb moving an animated object?
Inanimate objects?
No. In other words, using animation rather than a video of a human, could you generate a picture, a video, an animated video of a limb of some kind, picking up a yellow block and putting it in whichever container it's supposed to go in?
Yeah, I think that could be interesting. We are supervising the model through actions, so you would have to have actions associated with it. Like for instance, like you could potentially just generate a AI video of, you can just like ask the robot to like put this block into ask like a Sora model or something to generate a video of a human doing that or some animation of it, like a simulation. Or yeah, you can use simulation as well, which is you would have action labels. So we haven't tried, but I think it's definitely potentially possible based on what we're seeing here, right? There's nothing special about human. We're just like bridging their embodiments through colorful lines and some sort of overlays. Cool. And the interesting finding here is that so this black sort of color is robot plus human data without any skeleton overlay. So we found that the performance between using skeleton overlays and not using skeleton overlays is like equal. So what we're finding here is that to get semantic generalization to work, you don't really need the skeleton overlays. You can just simply co-train on just raw human data and you will get good performance that aligns with using skeleton overlays. So I think that was also a pretty interesting finding. And the last form of generalization, which is perhaps the hardest, is compositional. And the question here is, can we use human data to compose robots' existing skills together to perform a novel task? And let me kind of put this into context. So we teach the robot these two different skills, opening a box and pick and place. Once the robot is equipped with this knowledge, this is kind of out of order, but what we want to essentially do is teach a robot how to kind of open a box and put the block inside. So the robot has never seen these two objects together, right? Because it's only independently learned how to open a box and also just independently move blocks around. And if we just show the robot, this environment, it will just kind of like reach for the box and try to pick up the objects at the same time, right? So we want to add human data to this so that we can actually teach it to do the packaging task. So here, in addition to these two skills that you saw, we add a human video with actions showing how to open the box and put the object inside. And what we show is that with co-training, the robot actually learns the high-level sort of semantics of the task, and also you do use compositional generalization to use these existing skills together to perform this packaging task, which I think is pretty cool. And I think unlocking this level of generalization is kind of perhaps where the skeleton overlay shines the most. So this is kind of like the final task metric you care about. And you can see that using human data plus robot data plus skeleton overlays gives the highest performance, as opposed to just not, every other baseline. So I think this is, I mean, of course, like we show these kind of task and toy settings, but I think it kind of gives you a sense of what's possible with these models. So to kind of summarize this part of the work, we developed a fairly practical recipe for effective co-training across humans and robot data using foundation models, and sort of and we also looked at how we can adapt foundation models to sort of humanoid embodiments, since humanoid embodiments have a high dimensional action space. And we kind of show that you can use human data to kind of use the robot's existing skills to perform a novel task. And I think this idea should be sort of explored further to harder tasks. And I think it'd be really cool kind of coming back to that idea of sort of using robots in hospitals, right? You don't want to be teleoperating your robots around patients and nurses and all kinds of stuff happening around you. Maybe it'll be easier if we just equip nurses and workers with egocentric devices, and they can just walk around and just collect their everyday sort of interaction data, and then we just take a robot policy that's highly capable and is capable of a lot of manipulation tasks and merge it with that human data, and maybe it's like much better at performing the tasks seen in human data. So I think this, yeah.
So doing some compositional generalization from your first and second parts, could you use the high-level instructor that you had in the surgical robot basically to tell the low-level robot in the compositional box and block scenario that it needs to first open the box and then put the block in?
Yeah, I think that's also an interesting idea that we've been exploring a little bit as well, which is, you can just have videos and no action data, and we can just supervise at a language instruction level and have that hierarchical approach. I think that's totally valid, and I think worth exploring because that means that you can just use videos, right? And you don't need action labels, which unlocks like larger portion of data you can use. Thanks for the question. Oh, I got a chat. The question was, does this mean that we get a future where consumers can buy general purpose robots on Amazon, for example, and the consumer themselves train the robots to perform whatever task they wanted? I think that's kind of the one way of deploying these robots. I can't speak for like what the final solution would look like, but I think this is definitely like what we would be interested in. And actually, this project was done in collaboration with Meta, and Meta approached us because they wanted to, because they have a manufacturing line for assembling Quest and Meta Ray-Bans, and they have a huge manufacturing plant, and they want to cut costs, and they want to be able to deploy robots. And doing teleoperation from a consumer point of view is like kind of a high learning curve, at least at the moment. And so they were really interested in the idea of using Meta devices to collect egocentric data and then merging it with a capable robot policy so that you can kind of like use human data to kind of prompt, sort of prompt the robot to do certain tasks that it already knows how to do, but in a novel way. So like if you have like a new manufacturing line and you need to deploy robots there, then you don't want to, it's hard to collect teleoperation data, but it's easier to just give your workers glasses and have them collect data, human data, right? Oh, it's 57. So for the remainder of the talk, I'll just quickly breeze through like a few projects I've been involved in. So it's kind of coming back to the surgical land. This is like a project that we did in collaboration with NVIDIA. And we basically use Cosmo world model and fine tune it on our gallbladder data set. And I just wanted to kind of show some pretty cool visual results. So this is the original trajectory of the video and the Cosmo world model. And we prompt the Cosmo world model to move the left arm all the way to the left. And the generated video model is actually like doing a pretty good job of stretching this gallbladder like really, really tightly. And same thing here, if we ask the Cosmo model to sort of move the right gripper all the way to the left, and it's really pulling this sort of artery and really stretching things out. And I forgot to mention this, but world models can be useful in helping evaluate policies and compare policies. And recently, it's been shown that you can use world models to train robot policies and improve it. And so I think we're taking similar steps in the surgical domain. I think there's a lot of promise in this direction, especially if you don't have a robot to work with or a patient to work with. And recently, we also kind of got together as a group with NVIDIA and Johns Hopkins and TUM and Stanford and other 25 other institutions. And we collected like this large scale data set, including like not just surgery, but like other types of medical data. Like, you have a person using their hands to suture and like ultrasound data. And this is kind of, you know, analogous to like the OpenX embodiment effort, but except we do it for surgical. And so we're really trying to kind of grow this community, and we did like a bunch of evaluations with coach pre-training on this data and getting some suturing tests to work. But I'll kind of skip that. And we also kind of you know train on this large scale data set to create like world model for health. And I think increasingly this community is growing, and I think if anybody's interested, it's a really great time to kind of dive into this type of research, and I'll be happy to chat with you more if you're interested and help you get started. Just like briefly touching on future works, I think just kind of like random thoughts that I think surgical robotics is promising because you already have teleoperators worldwide. Like you have surgeons, millions of surgeons performing surgeries every day, and none of that data is being collected. And so I think it'll be really impactful if we can kind of tap into that workflow and just channel a little bit of data. So for instance, manual laparoscopic tools, you cannot collect any kinematics data from them, but you can record videos. So can we like equip surgeons with tools that they can use to sort of to extract kinematics data, and we can, as roboticists, like use that to kind of train policies and so on. And there's a lot of like work to be done on the modeling side as well. Like for instance, using preoperative data. Like current policies don't take in much context; they just use current RGB images. But in surgery, you care about the patient's history, their MRI, their CT images. They'll like reference these preoperative images to help them guide through the surgery. So I think trying to integrate those meaningfully would be great. And obviously, kind of related to that, in general, like current policies lack historic context. I think this is or just, how do you think about context for a robot model in general, right? Not just in surgery. I think that's another impactful direction to be working on. And obviously, none of our models are perfect. And so really ensuring safety and reliability, ultimately getting to that sort of near 100% success rate, I think is going to be key to deploying these models. But yeah, with that, thanks for listening to my talk.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple of questions. We just hit 4 p.m. So if anyone has questions here in person, or if there are questions on Zoom, feel free to put them on the chat, and I'm happy to read them out too.
So I understand the benefit of trying to have the generalization of a humanoid robot. But I guess as a null hypothesis for any particular task, you have to prove yourself more effective than having, something that's kind of simpler. So I mean, there's long been in hospitals, safe automated devices to deliver medications to bedside. You could have screens for either collecting interview data or questions for a nurse or a virtual nurse. And so, I mean, I'm wondering whether there's a desire to kind of focus your application domains on things that are not readily doable by a more simple specialized tool.
Yeah, sorry. What was the question again? Sorry, the audio was a little bit bad. What's the core question? Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, basically, in terms of scope, is there an attempt to try to focus on tasks that would be that a simpler specialized tool, like for example, a video monitor to a virtual or real nurse for diagnostic questions, or a purpose-built simple device that brings medications to the bedside. Those are already essentially solved, right? And so I'm wondering are you focusing on any, aiming to focus on something as to the exclusions of those that might be easier to do with more specialized symbol?
Yeah, definitely like yeah, there's definitely like a lot of specialized things you can think about. Often in surgery, not all the time, perhaps like if you want to think about enabling the surgeon to do something they cannot do, it often comes down to like designing hardware, like very, very small tools or and yeah, I mean, our no, like definitely like we are solving tasks that humans can already do, but there's also like the issue around not having enough surgeons, and I think and there's also like you know lack of surgical assistance and so on. So that's kind of like one direction, and there's like the other direction of sort of enabling surgeons to do things they cannot do. And right now we're not super heavy on that sort of hardware innovation, but it's also equally important. And yeah, but I'm definitely open to exploring those directions in the future. Yeah.
I mean, I guess the surgical things seem more, very clearly value added. What is less clear to me is the value added of the kind of, you know, uh, hospital kind of nurse extender. I mean, in the sense that there are a lot of there are a lot of machines already there that do that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Like I think there's always you can always make labor more and more easy. Like, I mean, if you go to a hospital, like nurses are just heavily overworked. Everybody's so tired and always understaffed. And I think definitely like physically it's possible, but I think there is some room for robots helping out so that we can ease the labor a little bit and you know um, I wouldn't say replace. Maybe replacement is potentially one possibility, but I think in general, I think we can always use more help. Um,
Other questions? Um, if not, then we can wrap up here. Thank you again to Dr. Kim for giving this great talk.